So in 7.4, kind of the last major section we're going to really talk about in this unit, talking about different costs of living. So we spent a lot of time talking about charting our data, charting our earnings, budgeting, but we've never really talked in detail about the things that go into our budget and the things that we really have to plan for. And well, there are four major categories that we're going to talk about. So you can see the first one here, right? But you have housing costs, you have costs associated with your car, you have food costs, and you have other kind of personal needs and wants that are going to be important too. And this personal category can very much be kind of like this miscellaneous thing, this miscellaneous category. So we'll come back to that toward the end. But I want to start with the biggest one, which is absolutely housing costs. And we've already talked about kind of the big one, right? So I'll say that we've already talked about mortgages or rent. We've kind of talked at length about what goes into these things, kind of how much you should budget for it. But a lot of this is going to cross over. Some things are going to be rent specific, and if they are, I'll mark them with a little R here. But we have, a ton of other expenses too. Let me leave myself some room here. Other housing related expenses can kind of run the gamut of just about anything. So obviously you have your rent and mortgage, depending on if you're leasing or owning a house. Mortgage, there's a G in there. If you are renting, you might have some added on facility fees too. And these are going to cover things associated with any sort of like common amenities. So this could be like laundry services. I can't spell tonight. Laundry. Oh, let me just rewrite that. So common amenities could be things like laundry. Maybe there's like a common pool or like a gym. You get the idea. So any sort of common thing, well, you're gonna have to pay for that up front if you're planning on using it. Obviously, there's renters or homeowners insurance, depending on if you're renting or buying. You have utilities, which really have two main categories. I'm going to talk about it later, but just to preview it. Um, you have kind of like your electric, water, actually, I'll call them kind of municipal utilities, so to speak. These are things like electricity, water, gas, oil, um, and you have kind of electronic utilities. So I'll discuss those differences in a couple seconds. You might just have kind of some catch-all miscellaneous housing expenses, so maybe things like cleaning supplies, any toiletries, um, I don't know, maybe bedding, right? Just anything that doesn't really fit into a category here that you do need to budget for. Things like furniture, which this expense can actually vary a lot. And then if you're renting, obviously you have to think about a security deposit also. Um, and some amount of maintenance, either all of it if you're owning or some of it if you're renting. And kind of your choices if you're hiring or if you're planning on doing this yourself. Either way, you still have to budget for some amount of maintenance, right? Eventually, inevitably, something's going to go wrong with a house. But the thing I want to talk about right now are utilities. If I'm talking formally about utilities, um, these are usually any sort of services you are billed for. Either by your city or town or a third party. So I want to start with kind of the big category, which is like electricity, natural gas, water, things like that. And with those cases, so I'll say electric, gas, water. You'll have workers go around and take readings of certain meters. Workers, um, say, take meter readings to determine your monthly usage. and then also your monthly bill. Um, for things like electric, gas, and water, you can't really shop around, so you can't really compare rates. Usually with electric, you are locked into a certain company's grid. Um, Gas, you actually may be able to shop for a little bit, and then your water bill is usually through your city or town. Some cities and towns also may have sewer that gets lumped in with this, or maybe you have well water. Right, every case is different, but when we think about kind of like municipal utilities, things that you would pay through like your city or town, these are usually the three or four that you think of. And if we want to kind of talk about the way we get billed for these, right, we have certain units that we talk about. If we're talking about electricity, we're usually talking about something called kilowatt hours. It's more or less, really speaking loosely here, the number of, well, kilowatts, right, thousands of watts, that you're using in an hour-ish. That's a really, really loose, broad, rough definition. That's not law. But just to kind of give you an idea of how this works, right? Or I guess if it's called kilowatt hours, it's more specifically the number of kilowatts you use per, like, times the number of hours. Just thinking in terms of how units work. Um, and then with natural gas and water, I'm just going to abbreviate here. You're usually billed not just by the cubic foot, but by what we call CCF, which would be 100 cubic feet. But I mean, if we talk about electronics as well, I mean, these have pretty much become necessities also, right? The kind of key underlying all of these utilities is that they're all in some form of necessity, right? You need electricity, you need gas to heat your house usually. You need water to run a lot of things, right? A lot of times you need a sewer system. Well, electronics in a lot of ways have also become somewhat of a necessity. In a lot of ways, actually. Um, right, these are things like internet, phone, TV. A lot of companies will bundle these together now. And here you do have the option to shop around. So I'll say that you can and you should shop around. Find a plan that fits your needs. Find a plan that really works best for what you're intending to kind of get out of your internet, phone, and TV. And you have every right and every um, reason to do so, to find one that really works. So there's a lot that goes into really owning a home, and that's why it's such a big purchase. It's such a big thing. We spent a lot of time in the last unit talking about this. Um, but the other one, I'm going to start over here with car costs. Actually, I'll just leave it kind of like this. It's fine. So the other thing we really want to start thinking about is what it costs to actually own a car and actually drive your car. The biggest thing, maybe the most obvious thing, is your gas. And there are a lot of factors kind of at play here that we want to consider. Right, these could be anything like the fuel efficiency, could be the distance you're driving to work, especially. Right, part of why people want to live relatively close to their jobs is so that they're not shelling out a ton of money in their commute. Um, Proximity to other destinations. How close is the nearest supermarket? How close is the nearest beach even, or Target or Walmart or whatever? How easy is it for me to get somewhere? Or am I kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere? It takes me 30 minutes to get to a Stop and Shop. Um, and then just any other driving that I want to do, right? Do I want to go take a drive every so often? How much other driving am I just going to do at random? If you're in a long distance relationship, you're going to spend a lot of time driving to your significant other a lot of the times. Or maybe you don't do a lot of driving. Maybe you prefer to bike, everything's really close together, or walk. It all depends on your situation, and that's what makes gas vary a lot. It makes it really hard to budget for, just because there is so much variation. Insurance tends to vary too, but not by as much, not by nearly as much as gas does. We spent a lot of time talking about the ins and outs of what insurance does, what it covers, and how much it changes, right? And if you remember, the price varies greatly by age, by gender, right? We said that insurance is very much sexist towards guys. By state, accidents. If you're the more accidents you get, and obviously the more it's going to cost for your insurance, as you remember. Um, and all this, of course, if you remember, goes into your premium, which varies a lot. And as a result, you have the right to shop around, and you should shop around for good insurance. If you feel like your premium is starting to get too high by factors outside of your control, there's nothing wrong with shopping around and trying to find a new insurance plan, a new insurance rate. Trying to get a really good deal on that. The other thing that can tend to be kind of an emergency type of fund is maintenance. Obviously, you shouldn't have to get your car taken care of every month. I mean, if you did, that would obviously be bad. Oops. Yeah, have to get your car fixed. Right, I wouldn't want to get my car fixed every month. If I had to keep taking my car to the shop every month, I think it's time to get a new car. But you should still set aside money just in case. You really want to be safe with this, right? You don't want to get hit with these thousands of dollars in repairs and realize, oh crap, I don't have the money for it. So it's better to have the money set aside just in case. And if you don't wind up using it, great. Keep it saved for a more expensive issue, or treat yourself, right? But I'd rather have the money saved up to find out that I don't need it than to not have the money saved and wish I had. Of course, all of this is null and void if I'm talking about public transportation. If I live in a city that has access to public transportation as kind of its main mode of transportation, right? My example is always New York, where most residents really don't own a car. Well, there's really no need for a car then. And in a lot of ways, this can actually save a lot of money. And actually, it's better on the environment in a lot of ways too. But if you have the ability to take public transportation, and that tends to be the most cost-effective option for a lot of reasons, right? So this tends to be more budget friendly when possible. Especially because when you're living in a big city, something like New York, you need to consider that the cost of living tends to be higher for things like food, for things like rent. Right, you need to consider that you're probably going to spend more on these things than you normally would if you were to live in the middle of South Kingstown. I don't know. So public transportation becomes a really popular option when you do have to budget for other things more tightly than you normally would, depending on where you live. Food. Food is one of the hardest things to budget for. One of. One of the hardest things to budget for. Why? Well, I don't really know accurately how much I'm going to eat in a week. On any given month, maybe I decide to have people over. Um, in a case like right now where we're in the middle of a pandemic, I know I tend to eat more at home, so I'm spending more on groceries but less on dining out. Um, Maybe you hit a particular month where you're working late and you tend to grab dinner on the way home more. It's so much changes and so much of that impacts our food. Um, more than you might think. So just some kind of statistics on this. Americans, so all these stats are for Americans. Americans spend about 9.7% of their disposable income. So kind of income after, things like your mortgage or loans have to be accounted for, um, on food in 2018. It's the most recent source I could find, and that's from the USDA. Per year, at least I believe this was also in 2018 and 19, um, in that same year, or possibly the year after, the average American spent $7,203 a year on food. Out of that, 4,049 is for food at home. So things like snacks, eating, making dinner, things like that. And $3,154 on things like outside of home, so like dining. And this I got from a place called The Simple Dollar. So just to cite my sources. So $7,203 a year on food per average household. It's a lot of money. Um, well, there are ways we can kind of control this and ways we can limit our spending to be a little safer, to be a little more careful, especially if things like rent do get tight. Well, there's a way around this, right? So some tips. Out of all the things you could buy at the supermarket, the most expensive are meats. Meats are expensive. Anytime I go grocery shopping, that's always the most expensive item on my receipt. So what you can do, and I'm not saying all the time, but maybe one or two of your meals every so often is something more vegetarian. And there's still um, a lot of great vegetarian options that still give you a lot of protein, right? It doesn't just mean eat a salad once a week. Um, there are now, especially now that this is such a big trend, right? Um, there are a lot of great ways to still have kind of a full balanced meal that is vegetarian in nature. So I'm not saying go throw away your burgers. I'm saying maybe one or two meals a week is maybe more vegetarian in nature to save yourself some money. What I think by far though is the biggest tip, this is kind of my favorite, um, is just to cook yourself. Make it yourself. I think it tastes better when you make it yourself, right? Because you've worked for this, so like you kind of taste the fruits of your own labor, literally. But what's really going on too is that pre-made food tends to be much more expensive because you're paying for the convenience, you're paying for the labor. There's a lot you can do with just the basic skills in a kitchen, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to learn them. This is something I'm really passionate about. I love to cook. I love being in the kitchen, making food, eating food, and there's what always amazes me is how much you can do with just the basics, with boiling water, just like cooking chicken and seasoning it the right way. You can do your The sky's the limit. It's incredible. I could talk for hours about this. I can't right now. Maybe a conversation for another time. Um, but really, it's learn the basics. Do yourself a favor. Learn how to cook, because you're not going to have a personal chef your entire life teaching you how to cook, or cooking for you rather. So learn how to do it yourself. You'll be glad you did. Anyway, end of tangent. Number three is to plan ahead. Plan your grocery list ahead of time. And this just keeps you from wandering the aisles, picking up whatever looks nice or whatever makes you hungry. Tip number four is to designate a meal prep day. The rationale behind this is it gives you access to ready made meals for the whole week. So this way you're not relying on takeout so much. So usually that day for me is Sunday. So that way I'll cook my lunches for work for the week on Sunday. So I've already got them, and I'm not tempted to just go to Dan and buy calzones every day. In college, it was Monday just because that's when I had a block of free time during class. I could cook my lunches and my dinners for the week and have it ready. But find a meal prep day to cook ahead for the week. And the last one is to keep inventory. And this is really there just to keep you from buying things that you don't need because you've already got it. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten home from the grocery store only to find that I already have 5 boxes of pasta or bags of rice or whatever in my pantry and I didn't need to buy it. So keep tabs on what you have. Always check your kitchen before you go grocery shopping. A lot of these are big tips, right? Things like rotating in some vegetarian options, things like getting into the habit of prepping your meals ahead of time. So the tips that I have for sticking with it, and these are kind of my own tips here, is baby steps. So the first step is just take it in baby steps. Maybe your goal this week is just to cook 2 meals for yourself ahead of time, or to rotate in like one vegetarian meal. Start looking, or maybe your baby step is just go online and find some vegetarian geared recipes that might be interesting to you. Um, you may be surprised with the options you find. Um, just like anything else, you can never form a habit by just deciding to go cold turkey and just start something new. You have to go gradually into it. The other tip is to reduce the frequency, not the expense. So you're better off if maybe you normally go out like 5 times a week to eat. Maybe your first step in making this work is to go out 3 times a week and then 2 times a week. Um, that's not to say, well, I went out 5 times a week for $20 a meal, so I'm going to go out once a week for $100 a meal. That defeats the purpose. Um, but you should reduce the frequency before the dollar amount. So it's easier to say, I'm going to go out twice a week instead of 3 times a week for food than to say, I'm only going to spend $70 at the grocery store versus $100. Um, because the reality is you don't know how much it's going to cost, especially in a time like right now. Prices are starting to go on the rise because of supply and demand. Um, it's easier to reduce the frequency of an event versus its expense. So some great tips, I think, partly because I came up with them myself, but I really do think these are helpful. Like seriously, I think you should try one of these before going to college. It will help you a lot. So one last quick bit are personal expenses. And really what I'm getting at here is the difference between needs and wants. Right? Wants and needs and wants. Needs are things that you have to budget for. These are maybe things like obviously your rent, some form of clothing, some form of cleaning, your groceries, right? These are things that you absolutely cannot take off of your budget. Things that you absolutely cannot take out of a budget. Wants are things that you should have money left over for. Right? You should absolutely have money left over to treat yourself. But if money ever gets tight, you can go without. These are things like, sure, I could switch to Spotify free if I had to. Would I want to? No, but I could, theoretically. I don't need to go buy this brand new pair of shoes right now. These work just fine. I don't need to get the brand new iPhone right now. Mine is still running just fine. Um, it's just tricky because these tend to be on a case by case basis, right? What you need is different than what somebody else needs. If I have a cable TV plan, I don't need Netflix. But if all I have to watch TV is Netflix, then maybe I do need Netflix. So it all depends on you. But the key takeaway is kind of what I've just summarized, and that's this. We need to budget for certain things. And that's kind of the whole point of the project that I'm having you work on. Things like clothing, cleaning, stuff like that. But our budget, if I make it right, any good budget should have money left over to support our wants. I don't want to come out with a zero balance at the end of the month. I want to have money left over so I can treat myself, so I can go see that concert, so I can go to New York for the weekend, so I can afford to have Netflix and Hulu and Spotify. Um, if I'm ending up every month with a zero balance, I'm not doing something right. Kind of mini takeaway too. Don't end your month with a $0 balance. You don't want to break even in a budget. No different than a business doesn't want to break even either. They want to make a profit. You want to have money left over too. Um, but when we talk about cost of living, that's really what we're getting at, right? These are kind of four main categories that we either need to, right, like your house, your car, and food, or want to make sure we can budget for appropriately. Um, and that's kind of the whole point of this chapter, this whole unit, is to put these things in perspective and figure out how to safely budget for them and do so wisely.